Today we have actually Yat from Animoca Brands on our podcast. It's next episode of Building the Open Web. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So maybe we can start with your background. Where did you grow up?
I'm ethnically Chinese, but I grew up in Vienna, in Austria. It was interesting because my parents were both musicians, and back in the 60s, I guess there weren't a lot of Chinese people or just Asian people in Austria. So I guess they found each other. Oh, hey, look, there's another Chinese person. Okay, anyway, so I was born and raised in Vienna, and I actually also studied music. And my mother tongue actually is German, which is a bit odd because I don't look very German, but I guess that's my background. So I guess that just means that I had a fairly international upbringing in the sense that after Austria, I then went on to live and work in the US and in Japan and in Taiwan and eventually in Hong Kong.
And how did you get also in computer programming? I remember reading somewhere that was fairly young age for you.
Yeah, so that's interesting in the sense that I had access to a computer at a very young age. I guess it was a Texas Instruments TI-99 in the late 70s. So I would have been maybe 8 or maybe 9 years old. I don't remember. I had 16K of RAM. It was like, oh, that was a lot of space at the time. And that's how I learned programming, essentially. At the time, it was BASIC. And I guess my real introduction to that came later on in life, where I started writing on the Atari ST, essentially MIDI music software, really more as a sort of a tool to help myself. So I studied music. I wasn't particularly good at it, I guess, but growing up in Vienna, sort of you're around a lot of people who are just really good at it. And so what was my niche? How can I be different in a space where apparently I'm supposed to become a musician of some sort? And it was, in the area of composition where I saw that I had maybe an advantage because I could write software, self-taught, because there was no computer science courses, it's certainly in Austria in the 80s, to basically take these signals from a keyboard, which went through, a MIDI interface, and sort of translate this into notation. Back at that point, everything was still done on pen and paper. The software was very rudimentary by today's standards, but it became a very useful tool and was distributed back then through, I guess, what you call bulletin board systems today, like early forms like CompuServe, Genie, FidoNet. And I guess the part that sort of awakened me to the industry potential was, back then, and Sasha, you're probably too young to know this, but back then, you would distribute software in this concept of shareware, and if you liked it, then someone will send you a check, quite literally, right? Because there was no PayPal, there was no online payment system, and I did the same thing, and I was maybe 12 years old at the time. And so I didn't do it because I thought I would get, lots of money. I did it because it was just cool, right? How I got to write software. And I get to say, it's like the credits, right? And you always say, please send a check if you like it. Of course, you never expect to get paid maybe. And then, I think a few months later, I started getting checks in the mail and I did not have a bank account. So that was sort of the opening of it. Oh, wait, hold on a second. That's really interesting. And sort of gave me a sense of maybe where the world could go, and also gave me sort of more of a mission and purpose, which was really mine, as opposed to music, which was kind of my parents, really, right? I mean, I did it as a good sort of. So I'm an only child of a Chinese musician family. So for anyone who knows anything about Chinese parenting, that was it. My fate was sealed, right? I was going to go in this direction, right? But that is how I discovered essentially there was something else there. And I loved the computer because I was able to sort of program and get immediate results. And there was nobody telling me how to do things, right? That's the other thing. It was a blank sheet of paper of forms in form of code, and I could just do whatever I wanted. And full of mistakes and full of errors and full of trials. But I basically did it myself, right? And that was something that was very different. Back if I look at, for instance, how education is done, the computer gave me that liberty and freedom. So that was really the start of computers. And then Atari, because I wrote software on the Atari, was like, hey, this is kind of interesting. We'd like you to come sort of help us out and work for us. So I ended up working for Atari at a very young age, essentially as a teenager. And that was sort of an interesting parallel, as I see that day and time again, is age does not seem to be an issue when you're trying to hire for talent. I have no idea if it was actually fully legal or not, but they didn't seem to care at the time. And certainly, I think we see the same trend today in blockchain as well. You can be a kid, but if you're really good at what you do, I don't care how old you are, just come here and do stuff, right? So that's sort of similar.
And then in Atari, you work in Austria for Atari?
Yeah, so the headquarters for Atari was in Germany, but they had a branch in Austria. So we ended up basically doing sort of, I guess you could say it's more like consulting type work. But back then, it was just whatever you guys can do, and then ended up sort of then ended up being at the trade shows. That's actually the way that I ended up traveling around the world, because I ended up going to trade shows. I ended up basically sort of meeting customers, and then of course being very active on Genie on CompuServe. That, I think, that was another important development for myself, because I realized that I could make sort of pretty meaningful connections, both personal and for business, from people that I would never even meet, right? And I wasn't online gaming; it was really just chats, because back then everything was done on the modem, and I was using an acoustic coupler, which is essentially an attachment to a physical phone. In fact, actually, most people might not even know what that is. That sort of, for those of you who don't know, it's when you look at the phone symbol. My kids look at the phone symbol on the smartphone and say, why is it shaped this way? I don't understand. It's kind of interesting, but why does it have to look this way? Because of course nobody calls with a physical phone like that. But that's essentially what we used to do. There was an attachment to that, and then I had to sort of wrap it actually in a jacket to make sure that the signal wasn't going to be disruptive elsewhere. And the data transmission was painfully slow, but of course we were dealing with bytes of data, so I guess it was okay. Anyway, that's how we communicated. So everything was done in batch. So, I would log in the morning, download my, 30, 40 messages, and then I would process them and re-upload them, I don't know, 6 hours later, and with whatever sort of code or whatever sort of messages I had. And that was basically the way we communicated through this mass bulletin board system. But what was very interesting is that despite the fact that communication was really impractical, uh, I found myself having deeper and better connections in some cases with people across the world, because we shared a common interest, than perhaps the other sort of kids in which I was playing soccer with, and having generally kid fun. But I wasn't able to make these closer connections because maybe our interests were different, and that was also something very powerful. I don't know that I don't know that I necessarily recognize it as, oh my goodness, this is how it's going to change the world. But I just sort of intuitively preferred it.
Mm-hmm. And then that also brought you to United States.
That's correct. So basically, as I graduated from music, and then decided to sort of, this was my career, and then Atari was like, well, you should go to the U.S. And do something there in terms of get a proper computer science education. So I said, sure, no problem. And that's how I went to the U.S. Although I quickly discovered that actually I wasn't learning anything new in university at that point. So that was kind of one issue. And then I think the second thing was that, of course, halfway through my studies, Atari basically disappeared in the way that we would have recognized it back then. The Atari of today is completely different from the Atari, back then. And so I was caught stranded in Boston with a number of ex-Atari guys. We're like, okay, what do we do? We're sort of out of a job, and in my case, I'm in a different country, and I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to be here. But we decided to set up a company that would be, particularly in the visual side, essentially support the way Atari customers who were stranded at the time needed help. So in this case, we started sort of bringing in new graphic software. We updated some of the stuff that we were working on. We imported graphic boards to make them more advanced. So we had a nice little, I'll call it, small business that was able to capitalize essentially on sort of a captive, although dying market, because Atari was no longer producing computers, and we filled a temporary small niche. And I guess that was the start of my, real entrepreneurial career. I guess when you're unemployed back then, that was the way to become an entrepreneur.
And then, from my understanding, then you found yourself in SGI.
That's right. So what happened is after we started working on sort of the, I guess, Atari dying scene, as it were, we were very focused on the visual side of things. We were doing sort of we built 3D renderers. I mean, 3D renderers on 16-bit machines. I mean, it was astounding if I think about it today, the kind of things that we did with the resources that we had, in comparison. But in any event, one of the ways in which you could have very strong visual effects was to use, I guess, the equivalent of a quasi supercomputer, which at the time was Silicon Graphics on the IRIX platform. And we basically designed virtual reality modeling tools. Now, and we were one of the first, if not the first, modeling tools to use OpenGL, which was a standard that SGI really pushed at the time and is obviously still somewhat in use today. And the idea was kind of funky. This was in the early 90s. Virtual reality modeling became really popular because HTML was sort of coming really strong, and SGI wanted to sort of have a lead in that position. And VRML seemed like a good idea, which is basically the HTML version of VR. Right? So I mean, but no, everyone's talking about VR today, but this was in 1992, yeah, 93. Okay, so VR at the time was a bunch of lines that looked worse than Tron the movie. Right? So you would navigate. The idea was you would navigate through a virtual shopping mall, and you can shop in this virtual environment with like different lines and stuff, that kind of stuff. Right? Now the innovation was the markup language, right, where you had a language that essentially had that you could sort of code into sort of I guess a visual representation. The problem was, of course, that bandwidth speeds were terribly slow, and the shopping experience was simply nothing like the real world. But that was the vision anyway, right? And everyone got excited about that. And VRML basically was sort of spearheaded very much by SGI. They acquired our business as a way to sort of, together with like many other companies, they put together sort of this thing that they called SGI WebForce, right, which was their answer to Sun Microsystem. And cobbled together various acquisitions, big and small, and we were just one of those. And that's how I was sent out to Asia, having never lived in Asia actually before, just because I was the only Asian guy on the team, and knew the software, and I was not attached, didn't have commitments. I was like, sure, if you want to send me across the world, it's cool with me. So I went to Japan, then I went to Hong Kong, I went to Taiwan, and then ended up in Hong Kong, where somehow I, ended up staying for like since now.
And how did you get into entrepreneurship in Hong Kong?
Well, so the thing about Hong Kong that was interesting was I was there, working with SGI, and then I noticed. So there were two things. One, I couldn't get my email, which was kind of interesting. So because they didn't have an ISP. Now, mind you, internet service providers weren't a big thing all over the world, nothing like today, but you could still somehow get an internet connection. But I couldn't get an internet connection as a consumer. Right? It was just difficult. It was like really, really weird, and I really had to sort of hunt people down to get a connection. And it was sort of literally garage style. So I thought, maybe there should be an internet service provider. And at that point, America Online was starting to really gain some steam in America, and I thought maybe we could do something similar for this part of the world. And the second one was because my father is from Hong Kong, and although my parents are separated since a long time ago, I ended up getting permanent residency just because, I guess, of him in Hong Kong. So I didn't need a work visa or anything like that. So I said, hey, I don't need a visa to stay here. I can just sort of work, right? Having never lived here and know anything about it. I think the whole world needs internet. So why don't I go build an internet service provider in Hong Kong? Which was the idea. And this is exactly what I did. And it was, pretty much a failure. But but the reason why it was a failure was not that people didn't need the internet. I think that part, I generally got right? But I think the problem was that they didn't know they needed the internet, and they didn't understand why it was useful for them. And coupled with the fact that, of course, at the time I had very long hair, I was maybe 20 or 19 or 21. I don't remember. I was very young, and having really a kid tell you about what you should be doing because it's really important for your business to a person who is at least twice your age, if not more, and very seasoned businessman and professional, was at the time also, especially in Hong Kong, very, very unconventional. So today everyone's like young entrepreneurs, yeah, you guys know the future and whatever. And now we have ageism, right? Which is like, if you're too old, actually you might be useless in this new sort of economy or whatever you want to call it. But back then, if you were a 20 something trying to tell an older something about anything, it was like, you're too young, you don't have the experience, come talk to me 20 years later. That was really the attitude. So it was a complete flip, and I'm fascinated how that flip happened in literally just 3 decades. Anyway, that was my experience. But I became addicted to the concept of building things, because in some ways or fashion, the way that I had my earlier business experiences was also independent. Atari was not run as a centralized organization. It was not run in that fashion because they didn't have that DNA, and frankly, they didn't have that money. So we didn't have strong hierarchies then. It was only, I had a brief 1 year stint at AT&T, basically to pay for my startup because there was no VC funding. So and that was my first and last real experience on what true corporate hierarchy looked like. And I definitely knew that was not what I wanted, and that's not how I wanted to build the company. But it certainly gave me exposure to that. So that was kind of my experience there. And through Hong Kong Online, which was the name of the internet service provider, I did learn a bunch of things about doing businesses around a place like Hong Kong, around relationship building, and really, I would say that was perhaps my equivalent of a really, really, really tough MBA, because I basically firsthand probably was like 99.9% rejection rates in terms of I do not need this, right? And sort of learning how to sort of pitch and sell. And then the other thing, of course, was that during that time I had to then pivot the business, right? And I pivoted the business to a free online services company, I guess along the lines of a GeoCities, which was really free web hosting or blogging, I guess, if you want to call it that. But of course, this was at this point 95, maybe, right? So again, not a lot of hope to really make money. But I was very optimistic, and I said, you know what? I'm going to make money on advertising because that's the future. Of course, who would buy the advertising? I wasn't thinking really, because nobody would buy the advertising, but hope sells a lot. So anyway, so I went ahead and switched it out because the regular dial-up service just wasn't working. And one thing that happened is I got explosive growth in relative terms. So we grew to 300,000 members who were uploading, it was called Hong Kong Cyber City, who were basically uploading community websites across each of sort of the content fields that we gave them. And they basically went and expressed themselves on our service, which is pretty cool. But what was even more astounding, if I think about it today, is that because we had limited bandwidth, it was a 64K line, 64K, right, for the entire service. And I had dial-up direct connections. People would dial in long distance to upload the data because they could get access to the modem, which by that time was very expensive. And people would queue because we had to have a queuing system because we can't possibly sort of maintain that many concurrent similar connections. And so people would queue for 2 to 3 hours until they can actually upload their content. I was astounded. The idea today that you would wait for anything beyond 2 seconds before you get impatient for sort of your internet service is a standard. Back then, people waited. So I recognized that there was something. But the problem was that all my customers were very young. They were children or teenagers, right? Or university students. And they all loved this idea of what I was building, but they all couldn't pay me anything. So it was definitely a gap of that. So that's why I took the job at AT&T, because I couldn't stop the service because I had so many people using it, but I couldn't pay for it either. And then, the whole internet boom, .com 1.0 kind of exploded in the US, and I guess opportunity knocked. And someone basically went out and said, "Hey, we need to buy traffic." And so obviously at that point, we were, a relatively cheap form of traffic acquisition in comparison to many of the US counterparts. So they acquired us. And part of that capital, I ended up then starting Outblaze, which is now a holding company, but basically decided to go full on in the internet space, but in a different way. So based on the lessons I learned and the fact that I still didn't have venture capital because that didn't exist in this part of the world, I ended up saying, well, if I can't make money sort of building out sort of a big company like Yahoo, because at that time, Yahoo was, the the Facebook or Google of today, right? I'm going to build a company that helps others get online, but not as an internet service provider, but as a cloud computing platform. Now, back then, we didn't call it cloud computing. It was called ASP, Application Service Provider. But effectively, it's cloud computing. You have applications and services, and they basically just rent it from you, and you give them the compute power to do it, right? So we ran data centers and did all that stuff, and ran it as a B2B business. That business ultimately was acquired by IBM to become part of their cloud computing framework, actually over 10 years ago. But that was basically how we built it out. And I think the other thing that we managed to do, which was again circumstance, was that we built everything on Linux. And when I built the ISP, I built it on FreeBSD and Linux at the time. Linux was not as mature as NetBSD at the time, so we ended up doing that. And I'm actually not even sure who uses BSD anymore. But anyway, Linux became pretty much the standard. And we basically used off-the-shelf PC. So my first office, which was a dump, but my first office in Hong Kong was right next to the computer center, so that anytime there was a problem, we could just go and get parts and put it back in. And whereas our competitors, most of them US-funded VCs, all were running Sun Microsystems or even Windows to run the same infrastructure. And when the dot-com crash happened, that's actually when we grew, because the entire framework in which they built their businesses had a cost structure that was unsustainable. It was built on an infrastructure that wasn't practical. But what was interesting was that despite that, people still needed it. So our number one seller was hosted email. And hosted email at the time I was doing on a revenue share basis, which of course, made no money. And then everyone, including our competitors, switched it to a pay per user model. And the interesting thing was that they had to charge, $3 to $5 or maybe $8 US per user to be sustainable. And we could do it for 1 cent or 2 cents because we were running on Linux and they were running on Sun Microsystems, and they had completely different frameworks, and it was impossible for them to change that. So when the dot-com crash happened, their funding dried up, and many of them had to go away, but their customers still needed email, right? So it wasn't really a bubble in the sense that the service was valuable. It was just too expensive. And so I guess it was a combination of right time and right technology that we had, that we were able to basically really grow the business. So at one point, Outblaze had close to 90 million emails within our system. We were one of the largest anti-spam providers because we had such a large data framework. Something like maybe 10 or 15% of sort of internet email related traffic at one point flowed through our servers. So it was a pretty big deal. But we always had to keep secret the fact that we were based in Hong Kong, because most of our customers were in the US. So our emails, we hosted emails from Network Solutions and Register.com and Verizon and Juno Online. I mean, these are big service providers that American people were using, and had no idea that it was a company based in Hong Kong servicing them. And we had to be very quiet about that because there were obviously concerns around this. Anyway, that was sort of the beginning of when we really became, I guess, a business that was sort of had cash flow and sustainability. That was around 2001. And with that, built a framework essentially for what became the Outblaze Group, and doing things in gaming and doing things in broad sort of media entertainment, but generally kind of spearheading things in our part of the world as far as digital media and internet was concerned.
Mm-hmm. And how did Animoca came to be?
So Animoca Brands was spun out of the Outblaze Group as well a long time ago, but was focused on mobile games. So one of the things, the genesis of that was that we already had a games division already, and we were doing sort of online games and some console games as well. And when we were in the middle of the sale to IBM for the Outblaze Group, it was very consuming, because when you sell to a company like IBM, it's not very straightforward. It's not like, hey, I'd like to buy you, let's go. It was just, for the due diligence, it was 150 people from their side. It was crazy. And I since learned that when IBM does an acquisition, or I guess any large corporation does acquisitions, that's typically a style. So they're not, which means that they can't do deals that are very small because it's just not worth their while. And that process was essentially a 2-year process. So we kind of missed out on the whole sort of Facebook social gaming scene, which kind of came and went, right? But I was an early user of the iPhone, and we started sort of making apps on this, and we discovered that there were quite a few people who liked this device, and we basically took a bet at the time and said, you know what, I think mobile gaming could be the next big thing, or just mobile anything. But we couldn't do mobile enterprise because we had a sort of non-compete for 3 years, so that we couldn't go into the same segments we did on mobile because of the deal with IBM. So we went into consumer media, right? And gaming seemed like a very good thing because we already had a division focused on that. So we started doing mobile games, and we launched what was not Animoca Brands, but was Animoca as a company, which basically launched a title called Pretty Pet Salon in late 2009. And in 2010, I think it was, right? January, I think it was 2010 or 2011. Anyway, it was 2010, January, it just took off. It was sort of, we went from, an app that was making, sort of just launched, to $1 million in revenue on that one app on a monthly basis. And it was just explosive. So we definitely said, you know what, mobile gaming, this is it. We're going to go all in, and went in on that space together with a whole bunch of other guys, and then since then, Animoca split up into Animoca Brands, and another business that was sold to a listed company in Hong Kong in around 2015. And with Animoca Brands, we decided to go on to focus on branded games. And the original vision of Animoca Brands was because at that point we saw that mobile gaming was maturing and saturating. So we thought that licensing brands and IP into popular game titles was going to be the next wave of growth, and to sustain and maintain sort of a more better way of user acquisition. Because one of the biggest issues in any mature market, and certainly in mobile games, was that once you hit the mature market cycle, the advertising costs and the sort of UA basically becomes very high, and you're basically in sort of going into trench warfare, where everyone is essentially fighting it in the same way and trying to optimize it. Whereas in the early days, buying ads on Facebook, which is really rapidly growing, was very, very cheap. I mean, we were doing UA for 2, 4, 8 cents, 10 cents a user. I mean, today it's like 10 times almost, right? Or more, actually. In many cases, it's like 3 or 4, 30 or 40 times more compared to then. So we were able to grow because of the market, but it was not going to be like that forever. And so we had to find other ways to get better UA, and using brands and IP licenses was one way to do that. So that's what Animoca Brand was originally focused on. And then, of course, we found blockchain.
And how did you discover blockchain? What got you excited about it?
So the intellectual interest on blockchain had been there for a little while already, but I think our sort of moment, which is similar to many people I think in the industry, is when CryptoKitties came along. And so we had an interesting story on that, because we were investors and in the middle of an acquisition of a small studio in Vancouver called Fuel Powered, whose founder, or effectively co-founder, was deeply involved in CryptoKitties. In fact, shared an office with Axiom Zen, and that was Mick Nayem, who is their chief business officer and one of the co-founders of I guess, CryptoKitties/Dapper Labs. And at the time, Mick was, in the middle of selling his business to us, and CryptoKitties hadn't launched yet. So it was, he was not expecting that, CryptoKitties was going to take off the way it was, because essentially it was almost a science experiment. And we're still working about sort of, him becoming our head of North America and all that stuff. And boom, CryptoKitties took off, right? And not only him, but some members of Fuel Powered were also involved in sort of helping out the CryptoKitties development. So because Axiom Zen at the time didn't have really a game design, so they were not really a game company. So they were sort of very focused on technology and infrastructure and sort of that type of stuff. But it was really more of a sort of, collaboration. It was not sort of, and nobody was thinking that this was going to be necessarily large, at least back then. And when that took off, it got us all curious. And so what happened was that we clearly understood the potential of what would now be dubbed as a non-fungible token, where you could have permanent asset ownership of digital items. And whereas I think before, even though I guess the technology had that possibility, everyone was so focused on simply just the sort of fungible token aspect, which essentially almost sort of I guess people were just not able to see it because there was just so much sort of noise going on in sort of the fungible token space. And as part of that deal, we said, okay, you know what? Mick was going to basically go and join effectively full time the CryptoKitties team because of all that's happening there. But he would be retained with us in a sort of advisory role, and we would continue our acquisition of Fuel Powered, and we would then become the publishers of CryptoKitties in this part of the world. So that's kind of what happened. And so we announced our partnership with CryptoKitties, I think in January or February of 2018. So very, very, very early on, and decided that, we were going to double down in the blockchain gaming space at that point. And then we've done many transactions since. But that was really the beginning as to how Animoca Brands essentially got into blockchain gaming. Not just because we saw CryptoKitties, but because I guess we had a front row view to what was happening.
And fast forward to today, like how do you see the space evolving?
I think the broad vision and why we're so excited about the future of blockchain gaming is simply put, games today, for those of you who don't know about the gaming space, is essentially an asset space where people are buying virtual items. And the estimate is something like 50 to 60 billion US dollars last year alone in virtual assets. So $150 billion in the game industry that was spent last year. And more than a third was on these virtual assets. And by virtual assets, I mean things like, Fortnite skins or swords or weapons or, decorative items, right? That is what the virtual assets are. And so a player, when he buys the assets, he thinks of them as ownership. But the reality is he doesn't own anything. And one of the things that we also know as a long-term game operator is that when a game does not work out anymore because it's not sustainable or profitable for it to run, then you shut it down. And that's all fine for the game company because it can't sustain it anymore. But that's pretty bad for the player who essentially spent a lot of money. And I think the thing to understand is that gaming is a whale market in the sense that you don't have large numbers of people spending just $1 or $2. You actually have a high concentration of players spending a large amount of money on those, right? And so they invest, literally, they invest in it, right? In time and in money. And that investment disappears when the game shuts down or the game companies change the rules because they can. So it's kind of like a sort of a feudal kingdom, if you were, right? The centralized environment where really the game designer / game company gets to call all the shots. And if they don't like you, they can ban you, they can get rid of you, they can change the rules, so long as it does not hurt them too badly. So the motive of profit for them is perhaps one of the main drivers. And the power for the consumer who's playing the game is actually zero, right? Ultimately, the only effective power is to say, I'm not playing the game anymore. But it's hard when you've invested so much time into it, right? If you've played a game for 2 or 3 years and then they change the rules on you and you say, oh, I'm really pissed off, but are you going to leave after you've sunk in so much money and so much time and status and everything? So that's really has been one of the challenging things in online games, sort of since inception. But the also other thing that we think is that it is this aspect of it that limits the growth of the gaming space, which is already a fast growing space, but isn't able to grow faster because it's now become so centralized. And by that, I mean that a player needs to be able to have sort of not just this ownership, which blockchain can enable, but if he has ownership where the assets can be used elsewhere, the interoperable aspect, then we think that that will blossom a completely new creative industry that isn't possible today because all the game environments are effectively centralized, means it's permission. So if I take permission based, so if I take a real world example, if I was to buy a Nike basketball shoe in the gaming world equivalent, I'm only allowed to use that Nike basketball shoe in a Nike basketball court, for basketball. That's it. I can't use it for anything else. I can't wear it outside. I can't go and play tennis with it. I can't show it off to my friends. I got to go to that basketball court and only play it with all the other people who join that basketball court. That is the gaming world equivalent today. Now, that means, though, that only the owner of the basketball court is able to make basketball shoes. That's kind of what it is. And that means you have no way in which you can actually create the equivalent of a Nike or Puma or Adidas or fashion brand or whatever you want to call it in the virtual economy space, because the virtual items do not have an interoperable framework to go into virtual worlds, which effectively games are the most dominant form. I mean, you have other things like Second Life and so on that are also virtual worlds more than they are games. But the vast majority of our virtual existence exists in games. And there is no way for me to bring something that I like from one world into another, which means that there is no way to have a company build out this stuff. And so it becomes limiting that way. We think the industry will explode in growth and potential when you can have that, right? Because it doesn't make sense for the NBA to be making basketball shoes, right? But that's essentially what a game company is. And in fact, the NBA is, in our view, more powerful and more influential because it's got the competition of the Nikes or media brands or whatever that now have a way to create this ownership and participation from an external standpoint into the player base. Because just like gaming today, the only ones who benefit from the sport directly are the champions themselves. But not everyone is a Michael Jordan, right? Or Roger Federer, right? To be able to do that. The vast majority are participating in a more passive or casual way. And that's where the asset ownership, we think, comes in really important. And I think it's less important that people need to speculate and make money on those assets. It's important maybe for, I think, many of the crypto, sort of first crypto native folks, because that's how it started, right? The speculative aspect of crypto is what sort of gave it its first big explosion. So there's often a link between that. But I think for the vast majority of players around the world, it's more important to have ownership and to have interoperability than it is to say, hey, I bought this and it could make a profit. I mean, that is, it's nice to know that you can do that, but I think that will not be the primary driver as to why people want to have these virtual assets. There's, for instance, this element of nostalgia, which I think is really large, because gaming is also one of the things that sort of continues on despite the fact that you played it as a child. Not many industries are able to survive generations. If I play games as a child, board games or something, when I'm a 6-year-old, or play toys as a 6 or 7-year-old, I won't continue to play these kind of toys when I'm 20 or 30, right? The generational gap just doesn't make it sustainable. The same is true for the kind of movies you watch, or the same is true for TV shows that you watch, right? So what you liked as a teen or tween is not necessarily going to be the same as when you're 30 or 40. But as an industry, it grows. Gaming is like that. Just because I play video games as a 6 or 7-year-old doesn't mean I will stop playing games when I'm 20 or 30. In fact, I continue to play games in one form or another fashion. It may be a different kind of game, but I continue to play. So the market of gaming actually expands. It doesn't stop because I grew out of it. But for many, many years, especially those who didn't understand the industry, they looked at gaming as a segment that would end because it's child's play. So I'm going to stop gaming. You're going to grow out of it because you're a kid. But turns out, no, actually, we get more intensely involved in gaming as we get older and more invested in that space. So we become more comfortable with these virtual assets and items. And that means that these assets and items, I don't necessarily need to sell them, but I wish I could own them from 20 or 30 years ago. Whether I could use them in another game or whether I just keep them as a keepsake or pass it down to my children is of personal value and not necessarily of monetary value. It's like family heirlooms. 3 generations of a wedding ring that passes down. The silver in which that ring is made is probably worth very, very little, but the nostalgic value to the family is priceless.
And if you're a young founder today, starting the company in a blockchain gaming space, like what would you do?
Well, I mean, I think, first off, I would say, no matter if it's blockchain gaming space or whatever, if you're a founder building a business, you definitely need to feel like you know what you're driving for. I'm not saying that you need to know what to do, because most people who start a business don't know what they're doing. Certainly when I started building a business, I didn't really know what I was doing. I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know really whether this was going to work. So I think that's an important thing to distinguish. There is no such thing, at least as far as I know, where you can sort of have a 10-step solution as to what, with definite outcomes. But generally, I would say that having a very clear sort of a purpose and mission that you want to establish for whatever it is you're building is very important. And it needs to be something that is fairly large as a purpose, meaning that if it ends up being something quite narrow, you don't allow yourself necessarily the space to be flexible. Because in the beginning of any startup, including gaming startups, you won't know exactly what that product outcome will look like. It will meander for sure. And you need to be able to sort of be flexible that way, especially in the early stages. And often what I see is that people get stuck on a particular vision because they need to see it through. But then, when something else occurs that they need to take advantage of, because the broader mission is allows you that flexibility to say, you know what, that's our goal. So we're not going to be sort of, let's say, be specifically focused on on this function. We're going to shift and tilt, which is difficult. But I think that's very important. And I think it's even more so important because when you're in a fledgling industry that is experiencing rapid growth, particularly if it's in maybe innovator, or certainly in the early adopter stage of development, anything can change. That's the thing, as we have seen in blockchain. But as we have seen in internet in sort of the mid 90s, and as we have seen with smartphone, sort of between 2009 to 2012, nobody would know where it would go, and you had to be able to adapt. You can't build out a 3-year vision. Now, if you enter the gaming business today, there is a protocol now because it's a mature industry. There's a script. So you can be in a position and do something for 2 years and you know exactly what you need to do, right? But if you're in an emerging industry like blockchain gaming, for instance, actually next month is completely different from last month, right? And it is not just because of crypto pricing, which just adds an additional element that becomes weird, but it's behavior as well. It's societal, it's cultural. These are things that are shifting right now because you have, for instance, a very strong hardcore community who are trying to sort of hold on maybe to the way they think the world needs to develop. But at the end, if you think about the crypto community, there's 40, maybe 50 million wallets in the world. There's over 4 billion people online, right? I mean, you can't really say that's a big market, right? But it's a very influential market, and you have to play in that space to be able in the blockchain gaming. So you've got this wrestling challenge of dealing with a community of wallet owners that have a different view of crypto necessarily than what you might want to bring in. And so you need to be able to adapt that because, I mean, even today, when you think about standards, I mean, Ethereum, Bitcoin, certainly, but you don't know necessarily whether they're going to be as influential as they are today, 10 years from now, because the space of people involved is still so small, which is basically how the internet was in 90, 95, 96. You can't, so you have a general vision. You kind of say, yes, we need to be there. But how you get there you need to be super flexible. And so for blockchain gaming, the exact same rules apply. I think the thing that I think is very important right now is also for blockchain gaming is I think there's, looking at the market you want to serve is a tricky one because a lot of talk in the last year has been around how do we bring non-blockchain sort of users into blockchain gaming, into blockchain. And, you can do it through gaming. And I subscribe to that. I do believe that that is a great way because gamers really need blockchain as in the technology. They don't necessarily know what it does. But the onboarding tools for that, as we all know, is really, really hard. In fact, I would say it's worse than dial-up internet in the mid-90s at the moment, right? But still, it's a similar experience, right? You have to know technical terms. There might be failure. You don't understand what that failure is about. It's certainly not something that you can do easily. But I also feel that we're sometimes maybe focused too much on the blockchain neophyte, as in someone who doesn't understand anything on blockchain, because maybe it's not the right time for it. We haven't reached that stage of the curve. So rather, we need to go for the people who at least already have an understanding of it and go for the early adopters. And I think that's something that often is missed. For the people who own NFTs and for the people who own crypto, how many people who have a wallet actually own an NFT of any kind? It's tiny, and yet still we have a very large developing space. I think the last NFT report estimated something like $200 to $300 million market. that was developed over the last 2 years, which is fascinating when you think about it, just over a 2-year period, small as it may be. But it's only a single-digit percentile of crypto users that own an NFT, right? So the opportunity to bring in people who already have a wallet to NFTs is frankly just has just as much potential. So we need to marry and bridge that, and I guess you need to be flexible to make the shifts and changes that you think fit most for what you do, and that's tough, right? So you need to be willing to run these sacrifices because you're going to get it wrong most of the time until you get it right.
This is awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all these experiences. This is really valuable for the founders. Thank you for coming to Building the Open Web podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, so thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of this podcast at openwebcollective.com. If you're a founder looking for help with product, go-to-market, or fundraise, apply on the same exact website. It's openwebcollective.com. If you really like this episode, I would really appreciate if you give us a review on a platform of choice where you listen to podcasts to. And finally, if you're on Twitter, we are at OpenWebFounders. Again, the handle is at OpenWebFounders. I'll see you next week.